after I quit my job, I bought my dream beach house and disappeared for a while. I just wanted peace. Then on my very first night there, my mother called. "We're moving in tomorrow," she announced. "Your father already agreed." Before I could respond, she added, "And if you don't like it, you can find somewhere else." I sat there staring at the ocean, my hands shaking. Then I smiled. By the time they arrived the next morning, I already had a surprise waiting for them. "My name is Rachel. I'm 38 years old, and I want to tell you the whole version of this story because the short version makes it sound like a clever trick, and it wasn't. It was the result of 38 years of patterns, 11 years of a marriage that slowly ate the parts of me I'd liked the most. And one Friday afternoon in September, when I finally sat on a porch that belonged to no one but me. So let me start at the beginning. I have been, for as long as I can remember, the family member who absorbs things, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, consistently, in the way that certain people learn to do when they grow up in a household where someone else is always the loudest voice in the room. My sister, Gwen, is 4 years older than me and has operated at high volume since birth. Big feelings, big needs, big messes. All of them urgent. All of them requiring immediate response from anyone within range. My parents, both of them people who preferred a calm surface to an honest conversation, learned early that the fastest way to quiet Gwen down was to give her what she wanted. And somewhere along the way, without anyone ever deciding it consciously, the job of managing the distance between what Gwen wanted and what was actually reasonable fell to me. I was good at it. I was patient. I knew how to redirect and smooth and find the version of a situation that everyone could live with, without anyone having to say anything too direct. Our mother called it being a peacemaker. My therapist years later called it something else. Growing up, this translated into small sacrifices that didn't feel like sacrifices at the time. I gave up the bigger bedroom when Gwen decided she needed it for her art projects. I covered for her when she broke curfew because the punishment would fall on both of us if I didn't. I skipped a school trip I'd been saving for when the family money got tight, and Gwen needed new equipment for sport. She quit by the following spring. None of it was forced. Nobody demanded it. It was just the path of least resistance in a house where resistance cost more than accommodation. By the time I left for college, I had a deeply ingrained belief that keeping the peace was a virtue, and that the best thing I could offer any room I walked into was the ability to make everyone else comfortable. I thought that was generosity. It took me a very long time to understand it was a survival mechanism I'd outgrown the need for. I met my ex-husband Marcus in my mid-20s. He was smart and funny and had an energy that felt at the time like vitality. What I didn't recognize until much later was that his energy was largely directed at himself, and that what I had mistaken for a partnership was actually a very comfortable arrangement for one of us. Marcus had opinions about where we lived, what we drove, how we spent our money, what we did on weekends, whose family we saw at the holidays, what my career should look like, how I should dress, what I should eat. He expressed these opinions in a way that was never overtly cruel. He wasn't a screamer. He wasn't abusive in any of the ways that are easy to name. But he was constant, a steady low-grade current of preference and preference until after a few years I'd stopped having preferences of my own and just moved through the life he'd organized around himself and called it our life. I had a job I didn't love because he'd had reservations about the one I'd wanted. I had a house decorated in his taste because mine was a lot. I had a social circle that was primarily his friends and their wives, women I was friendly with but not close to because my own friendships had gradually gotten too difficult to maintain between his schedule and his needs and the sheer energy it took to keep everything running smoothly. What I didn't have by year 8 was any clear sense of who I was outside of being Marcus' wife. That sounds dramatic when I say it that plainly, but it crept up so slowly. I didn't notice until it was already true. The marriage ended the way a lot of slow erosions end, not with a single dramatic event, but with an accumulation of small moments, until one morning I woke up and felt with absolute clarity that I was living someone else's life and had been for a decade. I filed 7 months. After that morning, Marcus was surprised, which told me everything about how well he'd been paying attention. The divorce took 14 months and cost more than I want to think about. I came out of it with my car, my personal savings account, my half of the equity in the house, and a fairly comprehensive understanding of what I would never do again. For the first 6 months after the divorce finalized, I rented a small apartment in Asheville, furnished month to month, nothing on the walls. I wasn't ready to commit to anything yet, including curtains. I went to work, came home, cooked simple food in a kitchen that nobody else had opinions about, and slowly, quietly began the process of remembering who I was. I was an accountant. I was good at it, and I'd made steady, careful money for 15 years. I liked hiking and bad British detective shows and grocery stores, specifically the experience of walking through a grocery store alone, with no list from anyone and buying whatever I actually wanted. I liked mornings. I liked sleeping diagonally. I liked silence. These sound like small things. They were not small things. They were the pieces of a person that had been quietly folded away for 11 years, and finding them again felt like archaeology. Careful, slow, occasionally surprising. About 4 months into the apartment, I started looking at real estate. Not seriously at first, just the way you scroll listings late at night, when you're not ready to sleep, letting yourself wonder. I knew I wanted something smaller than the house Marcus and I had shared. I knew I wanted to be outside the city, somewhere with trees and quiet, and the sense that the nearest neighbor was not immediately adjacent. I had a number in my savings account that I'd built carefully over 15 years and protected carefully through the divorce, and I allowed myself for the first time in a long time to spend an evening seriously considering what that number could do for me. The search narrowed the way searches do when you start paying attention to what actually draws you. Mountains kept coming up. Western North Carolina, the Blue Ridge, the gentle old peaks that had been worn smooth over millions of years. Something about the landscape felt right. Unhurried, solid, the kind of old that makes your own problems feel appropriately sized. I started filtering for cabins, small ones, 1 bedroom, maybe a loft, properties that had been around long enough to have character, places with wood and stone and imperfection. I found the listing on a Tuesday afternoon in July. The cabin was on 4 acres outside a small town called Spruce Pine, about 45 minutes northeast of Asheville. It had been built in 1962 and renovated twice since then, the second time apparently by someone with very good taste and a commitment to original materials. The photos showed wide pine floors and a stone fireplace, and a loft with a low-pitched ceiling, and 2 windows that looked straight out at the ridge. The kitchen was small and had open shelving and a farmhouse sink. The back door opened onto a deck that jutted out over a slope, falling away into a valley. The price was fair and within what I'd allowed myself to consider. I drove out on a Wednesday morning to see it. My agent, a practical woman named Susan, who had been watching me search for 4 months with the patience of someone who understood that some clients needed to arrive at a decision rather than be pushed into one, met me in the driveway. The first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the absence of sound exactly, because the trees were full of birds and there was a creek somewhere below the deck that I could hear but not see. It was the quality of the quiet, the kind that comes from distance, from trees, from being far enough from roads that the ambient noise of other people's lives couldn't reach you. I walked the property before I walked the house. I went down the slope behind the deck and found the creek, which was shallow and clear and moved quickly over flat stones. I stood there for a few minutes just listening to it. I walked the perimeter of the 4 acres, through knee-high grass and into the edge of the tree in where the light changed and the air was cooler by several degrees. Then I went inside. Susan showed me the fireplace, the kitchen, the loft with its low ceiling, and its view of the ridge. She showed me the water heater, which was old, and the porch railing, which needed work in two spots. She was honest about both. I stood in the middle of the main room for about 5 minutes while she waited near the door. I wasn't looking at anything specifically. I was just standing in the space the way you stand in a room when you're trying to understand whether you could be a person who lives there. I bought it 3 weeks later. Sole ownership. My name alone on every document. The closing was on a Thursday morning in September. Susan had taken me through the paperwork carefully, which I appreciated, though as an accountant, I'd read most of it twice already. At the end, when I signed the final page, and the attorney passed me an envelope with 2 sets of keys, I sat for a moment with the envelope in my hand and felt something I didn't have immediate words for. It was mine, not ours, not shared, not negotiated, mine. A piece of the earth with my name recorded in a courthouse and nobody else's. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I drove to Spruce Pine. I spent the first few weeks moving in slowly and on my own terms, which mostly meant I drove up on weekends with whatever fit in my car and set it down wherever felt right. I wasn't in a hurry. The Asheville apartment was month to month, and I had no deadline. I let the cabin receive things gradually. My books, my kitchen things, the one good lamp, the quilt I'd bought at a craft fair the previous spring. By September's last Friday, I had moved everything that mattered. I loaded the final boxes into my car the morning the Asheville lease ended, cleaned the apartment, left the key, and drove up the mountain. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, gold light coming through the trees, the creek audible from the driveway. I carried the last boxes in and stacked them in the corner of the main room and stood there in the particular quiet of a place that has just become fully, completely yours. I made a simple dinner. I opened the back door and sat on the deck with a glass of wine and watched the light go off the ridge in stages. Orange first, then pink, then the soft blue of early dusk. The valley below filled with shadow. The creek kept moving. A pair of crows crossed overhead. I felt for the first time in 11 years completely at rest. I was 2 glasses in and half asleep in my deck chair when my phone rang. It was Gwen. I want to tell you about my sister, because the story doesn't make sense without understanding what she is, which is not a bad person exactly, but a person who has never in 42 years of living connected the experience of inconveniencing someone else to any discomfort in herself. She is not malicious. She is, in the truest sense of the phrase, blissfully unaware of her own impact. She moves through the world the way certain weather systems move, taking up space, reshaping the landscape. Genuinely surprised when people mention they've been rained on. Her romantic history is a series of relationships she describes as not working out, and that everyone outside them can see were variations on the same theme. Gwen found someone willing to fund her current phase. The phase ended, and she moved on. She has a talent for making her circumstances feel urgent and her needs feel universal, which is why she has never in 20 years of adult life been without someone to bail her out. Since the summer that someone had been our parents, Mom had called me in July to mention very casually that Gwen and her husband Derek were staying with them for a while between places, just temporary. I had made a sympathetic noise and not asked too many questions, because when it comes to Gwen's temporary situations, the less information I had, the less I could be asked to fix. That strategy had served me reasonably well for 3 decades. What I didn't know, what I learned later, was that by September, temporary had expanded significantly. Gwen and Derek had been in my parents' house for 8 weeks. They had taken over the guest room and the finished basement. Derek had a habit of leaving dishes in the sink. Gwen had reorganized my mother's kitchen twice. My father, who retired 2 years ago and had been very much looking forward to having his house too, himself was watching television in the bedroom to avoid them. My parents had a conversation sometime in early September. I was not in this conversation. Nobody thought to include me. The conversation, as I eventually reconstructed it, went something like, Gwen and Derek need to go somewhere else, and Rachel just bought that cabin up in the mountains, and Rachel lives alone, and Rachel has a lot. My mother told my sister. My sister called me on. The first night I spent alone in my new home, I was on the deck watching the last light leave the ridge when my phone lit up with her name. Hey, I said, because I always answer for Gwen no matter what I'm doing. Hi, how's the cabin? Is it amazing? I bet it's amazing. It's really nice, I said, and I meant it. And I was aware even as I said it that something was coming, because Gwen doesn't call to ask how things are going. She calls when she needs a landing pad. So listen, she said, which is how she starts every sentence that ends with her asking for something. Derek and I are in kind of a tight spot. It's not a big deal, but we need to be somewhere for a few months while we figure out next steps. And Mom mentioned your place, and I just thought, you've got the law. It's not like you're using it. Wait, I said, when you say Mom mentioned my place, she said you might be open to it. Gwen said smoothly. She said she thought you'd be glad to have company. I've been in the cabin for 4 hours, Gwen. I know, and I'm not trying to. It wouldn't be like permanent. 3 months, maybe 4. You'd barely notice us. We'd stay out of your way. Derek's really tidy. She said this without any apparent awareness of what our mother had spent 2 months experiencing. And honestly, R.A., you're up there alone. It might be nice to have people around. That phrase, you're alone. Up there. The way she said it, like my aloneness, was a problem I hadn't considered, a vacancy I hadn't noticed, an oversight she was generously offering to correct. I sat with the phone against my ear and watched the valley go dark. And I said what I always say when I need time to think and don't want to give Gwen any information she can use. Let me think about it, I said. She heard yes, because she always hears yes when I don't say no, because in 38 years of our dynamic, I have never once actually said no. Great, she said, brightening immediately. The way people brighten when a negotiation they expect it to be difficult turns out not to be. I'll tell Derek we can probably be up there by Sunday. When I said, let me think about it. A brief pause. Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Take your time. We hung up. I stayed on the deck until it was fully dark, and then I went inside and sat at my kitchen table under the one good light and thought, here's the thing about being the family member who absorbs things. You absorb them because the alternative feels too costly. The noise, the guilt, the performance of disappointment that someone like Gwen can produce on demand. It's exhausting to resist, especially when you've been trained since childhood to believe that your discomfort is a fair price to pay for other people's peace. But I was sitting in a house I had bought with my own money and my own labor, and 11 years of grinding through a marriage that had asked everything from me and returned very little. I was sitting in the only space I had ever truly owned, and my sister was calling from our parents' basement to let me know she was planning to move into my loft. I made myself think clearly the way I have learned over years of being the absorber to actually examine a situation before I respond to it emotionally. What would it actually look like? I asked myself if I, like Gwen and Derek, come up for 3 months. I didn't romanticize it. I tried to see it plainly. I had bought the cabin for quiet, for the specific absence of other people's needs in my immediate space. The thing I had been recovering from for 2 years was the experience of existing primarily in relation to someone else's preferences. If Gwen and Derek moved into the loft, Derek, who according to our mother left dishes in the sink, who had strong opinions about everything, and the confidence of a man who has never once been told his opinions weren't welcome, what would be left of the thing I had bought, and 3 months in. Gwen's personal history, 3 months was not a unit of time. It was an opening, position, every temporary arrangement she had ever made had outlasted its stated timeline by a factor of 2 or 3, because Gwen's concept of time was elastic and her concept of other people's patience was essentially unlimited. I thought about giving her the answer she was expecting, the accommodating answer, the one I'd been given my whole life. Then I thought about the creek, the ridge, the wine on the deck, the 4 hours I'd had. I opened my laptop. The Airbnb listing took me 45 minutes from start to publish. I had good photos already. I'd taken dozens when I first visited the property, and the listing agent had shared the professional ones from the original sale. The loft photographed beautifully, especially in the morning when the light came through both ridge-facing windows and turned the pine floor gold. I wrote a clean description: private mountain retreat, loft suite with ridge views, sleeps 2 comfortably, full access to Greek and deck, 15 minutes from Spruce Pine, 45 from Asheville. I set house rules. I set a check-in time. I priced it out what I'd seen comparable properties charge, which was enough to meaningfully offset the cabin's costs without being extractive. I published it just after 9 o'clock in the evening. I had my first inquiry inside 20 minutes. A couple from Charlotte named Carolyn and James were looking for a long weekend in the mountains. They'd been watching availability open up and had set alerts. They found my listing and sent a message that was warm and specific. They mentioned the creek. They mentioned the ridge view. They asked one sensible question about parking. I confirmed availability and accepted the booking. Check-in. Saturday morning, 9 a.m. I closed the laptop. I sat at the kitchen table for a moment with a very specific feeling that I didn't have an immediate name for. Not triumph exactly, not even satisfaction. Something quieter. The feeling of having responded to a situation by doing something true. Something that came from actually knowing what I wanted and acting on it. Without apology, I texted Gwen that something had come up with the cabin and I'd need to talk before any plans were made. Then I turned my phone face down, made a cup of tea, and went to bed in my own room in my own house and slept better than I had in years. I didn't hear back from Gwen that night, which told me she was either asleep or performing unhappiness for Derek and hadn't gotten to me yet. In the morning, I had a message from my mother. It was brief, just Gwen says, "You're thinking about it. That's so good of you, Rachel. I knew you'd come through," which told me Gwen had reported my "let me think about it" as a probable yes, and our mother had received it as a confirmed yes. And somewhere in the chain, a conversation had happened that moved from probable to confirmed without anyone checking with me. This is a thing I have watched my family do my entire life, and it still catches me off guard every time. The preemptive yes, the assumption that my silence or hesitation is a formality on the way to agreement rather than an actual position requiring an actual answer. I put my phone down and went to prepare for my guests. Caroline and James had said 9 a.m. and I believed them. They struck me from their message as people who meant what they said. I made the loft bed with fresh sheets. I left 2 clean towels on the footrail. I put a small basket on the kitchen counter with coffee and tea and a few snacks and a handwritten note with the Wi-Fi password and the creek path instructions and the name of a good breakfast place in town. I stood at the bottom of the loft stairs for a moment and looked up. It was a good space, warm and quiet and full of morning light. It deserved people who wanted to be in it. They arrived at 8:53. Caroline in a fleece and hiking boots, James with a day pack over one shoulder. They had that particular quality of a couple who had been together long enough to move comfortably in parallel. She went straight to the kitchen windows to look at the view. He went to the back door to locate the deck. I gave them a 10-minute orientation and left them to it. By 9:30, Caroline was on the deck with my coffee in a borrowed mug, watching the Fog dissolve off the ridge into the valley below. The kind of unhurried, deeply present watching that happens when people finally get somewhere they've been looking forward to. I was inside making a second pot when I heard tires on the gravel. I recognized the sound before I looked. Gwen's minivan has a particular frequency when it's fully loaded. She's driven it heavily since she bought it 2 years ago, and the engine note has dropped half a register. From the weight, I knew it the way you know the sounds of people who have been moving through your life since before you were old enough to understand what was happening. I looked through the kitchen window. The van was loaded floor to ceiling. I could see it even through the dusty windshield, boxes stacked to the headliner, bags wedged into every crevice, the back row folded down to make room for what appeared to be a mattress standing on its side. My sister had packed not for a visit or even for a temporary stay. She had packed the way people pack when they intend to live somewhere. Derek was in the passenger seat, head down over his phone, doing the thing he apparently did when arrival at someone else's house felt awkward. Gwen stepped out of the driver's side with the energy of a woman completing a journey rather than interrupting someone else's morning. She looked at the cabin with the approving survey of someone who has been picturing a place and is confirming it matches the picture. She started up toward the porch. She stopped at the bottom step. Caroline was on my porch in one of my 2 chairs, wrapped in a fleece, holding my coffee mug, watching the fog lift off the ridge with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. Gwen's forward momentum paused. "Who is that?" she said, loud enough that I heard it from the kitchen. I came out and stood in my doorway. Caroline looked over her shoulder at us, gave a small, pleasant wave, and went back to watching the valley. "That's my guest," I said. "She and her husband are here through Monday." Gwen looked at Caroline, then at me, then at the minivan, which was still running, then back at me. "You have a guest," she said. It was not quite a question. 2 guests. I listed the loft on Airbnb last night. The words arranged themselves in my sister's face in slow motion. I watched her track from confusion to calculation to a dawning, reluctant understanding. "Last night," she repeated right after we talked. A longer pause. Derek had gotten out of the van now and was standing beside it, with his hands in his pockets, reading the situation the way someone reads a situation when it has clearly gone wrong before they arrived, and they are uncertain how involved to be. "Rachel," Gwen said, and her voice had dropped to the register she uses when she wants to communicate that she is being very patient and very reasonable, and I should appreciate it. "I drove 4 hours. I know. I'm sorry about that. You said you'd think about it." I did. I said I thought about it for about 20 minutes. Then I decided I'd rather list the space. She stopped, started again. "The loft is booked through February." Actually, this was true. Caroline and James' booking had triggered the algorithm, and 3 more bookings had come in overnight. Before I'd fallen asleep, I'd checked my phone with a coffee that morning and found a calendar that looked pleasantly full. Gwen looked at the van, at the boxes visible through the windows, at Derek, who had the expression of a man making careful calculations about what role, if any, he intended to play in this conversation. He glanced at me, looked away quickly. "You can't just," Mom said. "You were open to it." "Mom was wrong," I said, and I didn't tell her she was wrong because nobody asked me. "You told her," I'd said. "Let me think about it." And she heard yes. Gwen opened her mouth. "I'm not angry," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not yelling. I'm not upset. I'm just telling you what happened. Nobody asked me. You told me. It was decided, and I said I needed to think, and I thought this is what I decided." Caroline had turned slightly in her chair, not intrusively. She wasn't watching us directly, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had registered that there was a conversation happening behind her that required the people having it to have it without an audience. She picked up her mug, stood up, said, "I'm going to go find James." and slipped inside through the back door, with the graceful tact of someone who has navigated other people's families before. Gwen watched her go. So that's it, she said. You're just we drove for hours. I know you did. I felt steady and clear, and underneath that, something sadder and more complicated that I didn't have room for in that moment, but knew I'd need to deal with later. But this is my house, Gwen. I bought it. My name is on the deed, and I didn't offer it to you. Mom said what she wanted to believe. I said she wanted the problem solved, and she told herself a story where it was solved. But I'm the house, and I didn't agree. Gwen stared at me for a long time. I watched her cycle through anger, then the appeal to guilt that I knew was coming, and I kept my face and my body very still, and I waited. You know, we have nowhere to go, she said, and her voice had shifted the edge of anger, giving way to something raw. We were counting on this. I know, I said, and I'm sorry that you were counting on something you hadn't confirmed. That's a hard position to be in. You could still say yes, she said, quieter now. I know I could, I said. I don't want to. Another long pause. A crow called somewhere in the trees above the driveway. The creek murmured in the valley below. Just through the end of the year, Gwen said. Almost a whisper. Gwen, I said her name, the way I'd been wanting to say it for about 38 years, gently but with finality, with the door clearly closed. Behind the word, I love you, I'm glad you drove up here because I got to see you, but you're not moving into my house. Derek drove the van out first, which I thought was telling. Gwen stood on the gravel for another minute after he pulled back down the lane, her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the cabin the way people look at things they planned on having. Then she looked at me. This isn't how family is supposed to work, she said. I know it doesn't feel that way to you, I said. But I disagree about what family is supposed to look like. She nodded once and walked to the passenger side of the van. I stood in my doorway and watched them go. When the sound of the engine faded, the bird noise came back, and the creek reasserted itself, and the fog finished lifting off the ridge, and the morning went on uninterrupted. Caroline appeared from the back of the cabin. She and James had evidently been making themselves extremely scarce, for which I was genuinely grateful. Everything okay? She asked carefully. It is, I said, and meant it. She looked at the empty driveway. Family, sister, I said. She nodded in the way that requires no elaboration. I made more coffee, she offered. I called my mother that afternoon after Carolyn and James had gone into town for lunch, and the cabin was quiet, and I'd had an hour to sit with how I felt about the morning. My mother answered with the tone she uses when she already knows something has gone wrong and is bracing. I heard from Gwen, she said. I figured you would. A pause. Rachel, they don't have anywhere to go. I know, I said, and I understand that's hard, but Mom, nobody asked me. You assumed, Gwen assumed, and then she drove 4 hours with a loaded van without ever hearing me actually say, yes, you said you'd think about it, right? And I did, and my answer was no. The problem is in this family, nobody waits for my actual answer because everyone assumes they already know what it is. Silence on the line. You've always been so flexible, she said, which is the family language for accommodating, which is the family language for going along with things. No, I haven't, I said. I'm not anymore. Not about this. The cabin has a whole loft. Mom, my voice was even and clear. This is not a negotiation. The loft is booked and the decision is made. What I need from you is to understand that I meant no, and to stop telling Gwen stories about what I've offered. Another silence longer. You could have said something sooner, she said. Finally, you could have asked me first, I said. I let that sit between us for a moment. I'm not angry with you, I said, and I meant it. I know you were trying to solve a problem. I know Gwen is a lot to have in the house, but I can't be the solution to every problem I wasn't consulted about. That's not fair to me, my mother said. No, I suppose it isn't. Which was The closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd heard from her in years, and I took it for what it was. The strange thing about that Saturday was how it ended. Caroline and James came back from town with a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine they picked up from a small vineyard nearby. They asked if I wanted to join them on the deck for the evening. I said yes, and we sat out there as the light died on the ridge, and the creek kept talking, and the wine was good and easy, and they told me about their jobs and their neighborhood in Charlotte and a hiking trail they'd found that afternoon. Normal, unhurried human conversation, the kind I'd been having so little of for so long. At some point, Caroline asked how long I'd had lace. I moved in yesterday, I said. She looked at me with something like recognition. Big day, she said. Bigger than I expected, I said. She left. James topped off my glass. The fog was back, settling into the valley below, and the stars were coming out above the ridge, and the place was exactly as quiet as I had needed it to be when I bought it. Gwen and Derek found an apartment the following month. Not a great one, a 2-bedroom in the town they'd been hoping to leave in a building that was fine, but not exciting, at a price point that required Derek to pick up some work he'd been putting off. I heard about it through our mother, who reported it in the tone of someone who thinks I should feel guilty. I don't. Particularly, I feel something more like relief on Gwen's behalf, because the evidence of her adult life is that she does better when she's required to figure things out herself rather than waiting for someone else to absorb the problem. The loft at the cabin stayed booked through the fall and into winter. I got a review from Caroline that called it the best short-term rental she'd stayed in outside of a major city, which I rented and put on my refrigerator. I had repeat bookings by November. By January, the calendar was full enough that I'd stopped thinking of it as income and started thinking of it as part of how the cabin worked. I updated my financial model for the property with the Airbnb revenue and my accounting work, which I transitioned to remote and part-time. The place was sustainable in a way that pleased the accountant in me and relieved the part of me that had worried for about 10 minutes the night I bought it that I'd overreached. I had not overreached. I had just learned very late and all at once to reach for myself, instead of perpetually extending in someone else's direction. The last thing I'll tell you is this. About 2 months after that Saturday, my mother called on a Sunday evening. She asked how the cabin was. She asked about the Airbnb. She asked carefully about the lot and whether I was managing okay with guests. It was an unusual call. She doesn't usually ask questions. She usually tells me things, and at first I wasn't sure what to make of it. Near the end, she said something that I don't think she knew was significant. You sound different, she said, than you have in a long time. Different how? I asked. A pause. Settled, she said, like you know where you are. I do, I said. I'm home. And when we hung up, I sat for a while on the deck, watching the valley, listening to the creek. That word home clears throat. I'd had addresses my whole life. I'd had places where I lived and places where I kept my things. I'd had the apartment, clears throat, Marcus. And I bought and the apartment before the divorce and the month-to-month place in Asheville and every room before that. But I'd never had a home until the night I sat on this deck alone and opened my laptop and made one decision cleanly for myself. Fully booked, I thought. And it was not just about the lock. The whole thing was finally completely mine.